Welcome back with more experience. Today's topic is nicked, I have to admit it, from Andrew Dixon, his excellent YouTube channel. He had the idea a couple of weeks ago to make a ranking to rule them all, so to speak, a ranking of not just the Beatles albums or some solo albums like Paul solo albums, George Ringo, John solo albums, but to rank all Beatles albums, the 13 official ones, and all solo albums by each Beatle into one ranking. I think he must have been the first on YouTube who had that idea, and at the time of recording this video he hasn't yet released the final video where he ranks all the albums. I am a bit too lazy for ranking all albums, especially the weaker later day Ringo albums. There are many Beatles albums I don't really enjoy that much, Beatles solo albums, to listen to in order to make a ranking where you really have to listen carefully and like a scientist almost. So I decided to make a top 40. I think this is like the upper half of all those probably 90 albums, and those are all albums I enjoy, I really enjoy. I would say those are all very good albums. It starts with Wonderful Music, the very first Beatles solo albums released in autumn 1968 by George Harrison. Great ambient record, probably the only official George Harrison solo album where his love for Indian music comes through. Soundtrack to a trippy 60s movie called Wonderwall, of course. Number 39 is Off the Ground, sometimes ridiculed. It was probably the most uncool phase to be a Paul McCartney fan, but I always had a soft spot for that album maybe because it was the first Beatles solo albums I've ever owned, I've ever listened to, because around that time I became a Beatles fan, and this was the first new album by a ex-Beatle that came out when I started to become a Beatle fan, and I think it's a fine album. 38 is Flowers in the Dirt, the album before, maybe the volume 1 to Off the Ground's volume 2. I think it's slightly better, although I personally listen more to Off the Ground, maybe for these nostalgic reasons. But the strong songs on Flowers in the Dirt are a bit stronger than the strong songs on Off the Ground. Those strong songs on Flowers in the Dirt would be, for me, My Brave Face, Put It There, We Got Married, and this one. Those are, brilliant songs. 37 is Egypt Station, one of the more recent Paul or Beatles solo albums, next to McCartney 3, his most recent, and really impressive how at that time already a guy in his late 70s being that artistic, that creative, that eclectic, and also trying new things, new sounds, contemporary sounds, but still that classic approach to songwriting, like in a song like I Don't Know. Great album. 36, first entry by Ringo Starr, Goodnight Vienna. Great album, I think almost as good as its predecessor, which is of course his most famous and most successful album, but it's basically the same formula. Him and his All-Star friends, including the other Beatles, writing and recording great songs. 35 talked about and ridiculed Paul McCartney album. Well, this is the most, it's not really ridiculed, it's even worse than that, it's the most hated solo album amongst Paul McCartney fans. I'm one of the few who always, wouldn't say loved it, but liked it. I think it's a bit unfair how it got treated mainly by fans. Driving Rain from 2001. It's not that bad, it's a bit overlong. So there are also a few fillers on there, but there are great tracks on that album. I always defend it. 34, McCartney 3, the most recent Paul McCartney album. Like with Egypt Station, impressive how at this age he's able to do creative, not just making a decent album, but that creative. He's like a kid, he's still like a child in a toy store and playing around with instruments and sounds, and it's a fantastic album. And maybe when I made the top 40 Beatles solo albums ranking, excluding Beatles albums, I said I had it pretty high, like number 20, 25, and I said maybe that's a recency bias, maybe it will get down in forthcoming years. Maybe it went down a bit. You know, this is a ranking including the Beatles album, so it's obviously not going to be as good a position than in my only the Beatles solo albums rankings. Having that in mind, it didn't really go down much, you know. So there's no more recency bias now. I think it's still a good album. 33, again Ringo Starr, Few Cups of Blues. His second album, one of the most underrated Beatles solo albums, country and western album. But I don't think you really have to be a country and western fan to like that album. I'm not really a big fan of that genre, but if you like an album like Nashville Skyline by Bob Dylan, it's basically the same musicians and same studios. It's pretty much the same kind of melange. 32, Walls and Bridges. I think it's a bit of an overrated album, but you know, overrated doesn't mean it's bad. You know, it's in this list. It's a good position. It's 32. So nothing wrong with that album, but I think it gets a bit praised out of proportion by many Beatle fans and critics over the years. But it's a very good album, very good John Lennon Lost Weekend album. 31 is Retro Speedway. If I would rank the Archive Collection's double album version of it, it would be a bit higher, like 20 in the top 25 probably. That's a great, you know, that's the initially intended album, but the record label Capitol at the time, 1973, didn't want McCartney to put out a double album since the first Wings album, Wildlife, was a flop. And they didn't, you know, it's really strange now with hindsight to think like that, but only 3 years after the split of the Beatles, you know, the Paul McCartney stock was so low that the record label didn't trust him to put out a great double album. They were wrong. It's a great double album, but the single album that's now in this ranking is also very good. Paul McCartney album still has that charming homespun, very weedy feel of the early 70s albums, which, you know, critics didn't like, but you know, us fans, we love those albums. But it's already hinting in that big arena stadium, commercially a very successful era of Band on the Run and Venus on Mars. So it's a transitional record in a way, and great record. Number 30 is Double Fantasy, and as always when I'm ranking this album, it's not just Double Fantasy, it's Double Fantasy / Milk and Honey, because I often said it's just half a John Lennon album, and Milk and Honey is also just half a John Lennon album. The other half is, you know, done by Yoko Ono. So in order to have a full-length album, I put them together because they were recorded basically around the same time with the same musicians. So I think I can do that, and then it's a very, very good, a brilliant John album with great songs on number 30. 29, now my favorite Ringo album, called Ringo. It's slightly better than Goodnight Vienna, I would say, maybe because the formula was still very fresh. It was the first with that superstar helping out formula. And Photograph, of course, probably at least one of his 3 best solo songs. 28, not officially a Beatles or Beatles solo album, but it's Electric Arguments by the Firemen, which is of course Paul McCartney plus the producer Youth. The first 2 Firemen albums wouldn't have qualified for that list, I would say, because it's too much of a collaboration between Paul and Youth, and those are really ambient electronic albums. But this third Fireman album sounds more like a McCartney album. You know, it could have been called McCartney 3. I think he could have put it out as McCartney 3. Probably wouldn't have been fair to Youth, because he still had some involvement or much involvement as a producer in that album. But Paul plays most of the instruments, wrote those songs. It's a fantastic, adventurous Paul McCartney album, one of his best of this century, I would say. 27, Sometime in New York City by John Lennon, 1972. His most political album, but I have no problem with that. But what I really like about that album is it's his most rocking album. I always liked that side of John Lennon more than the balladeer, the somber balladeer, which we often had during his solo years. This for once is John Lennon letting it loose and rocking and rolling, and plus it's a political album, but I really like that vibe, that funky vibe of that album. 26 is McCartney's first solo album called McCartney. Includes, of course, probably his biggest solo classic, Maybe I'm Amazed. But the rest of the album is really cool because it's probably the first lo-fi, do-it-yourself home recording album by a big artist, and so it's a very important album as well. 25 is also a self-titled album. It's George Harrison by George Harrison. Maybe that's not a very adventurous album, but this is a collection of 10 brilliant songs. It includes 10 songs, and I think not really a big standout track, although I have 3 or 4 songs that are really among my favorite George Harrison songs. But it's more the album as a whole, especially in summer. It works brilliantly as an album during summer. It was released in autumn, maybe that was one of the reasons why it didn't work with critics and audiences that much. But also maybe because it was this yard rock, soft rock, in the midst of the punk era. Typical George, made the exact opposite, and a very soft album, but brilliant songs. I love it. 24, Flaming Pie. You can argue if either Flowers in the Dirt or Flaming Pie was the start of Paul McCartney's renaissance, when he's becoming cool again. But I think, with Flowers in the Dirt and Off the Ground, maybe some people, like the real fans, thought, oh, now he's returning to form. But with Flaming Pie, I think that was when really the tide started to shift, and more even critics began to realize that Paul McCartney isn't the silly love song guy, and the lightweight pop guy. He's that also, but that he's also a true artist. And Flaming Pie is, at least, if you're not one of those who say Flowers in the Dirt started it, then at least you would say with Flaming Pie that very long-lasting phase in his career started, where he basically didn't do any or many missteps. Some people would say Driving Rain, but I think artistically, from then on, there wasn't really much chunk. 23, McCartney 2 from 1980, his most adventurous album next to the Fireman albums. Brilliant, and with McCartney, it was one of the first albums where a major artist did a home recording album. So that wasn't the new thing about McCartney 2, but McCartney 2 is probably one of the first albums where a major artist really dabbles with electronic music, and Temporary Secretary even it's hinting into a hip-hop direction. It was recorded in 79, released in 80, so very much ahead of its time, ahead of its peers, Paul McCartney here. 22, now the first Beatles album in that list. Yellow Submarine didn't make it in the top 40, I have to say. Just 4 new songs. That wasn't enough for me to beat Wonderful Music and all the other albums after that. But with the Beatles, so to speak, next to Yellow Submarine, my least favorite. But it's number 22. It's a great album. Now we're really in territory. Each album now is an excellent album. The next album is also from the Beatlemania phase. It's the album after that. Some consider it the first Beatles masterpiece. It isn't yet. It's almost a masterpiece to me, A Hard Day's Night, but I think on side B there are 2 or 3 fillers, so it's the first album with just compositions by themselves, by Lennon and McCartney. So that was the big innovation on that album, but I think it's not that much better than with the Beatles, in my opinion. But I would say from now on, number 20, top 20, I would say from now on each album is a masterpiece to me. So A Hard Day's Night is almost a masterpiece. Number 20 is Chaos and Creation in the Backyard. To me, the best Paul McCartney, and so it's also the best Beatles solo album of the 21st century yet. Chaos and Creation in the Backyard, fantastic album, and also could have also been called McCartney 3. We've had it with Electric Arguments. Also that album applies as basically the same principle of Paul playing most of the instruments. So from now on, only masterpieces. Number 19 is one of my favorite George Harrison solo albums, Living in a Material World. 73, very spiritual album. It's a continuation of what he did with All Things Must Pass, but maybe a bit more sparse, a bit more intimate, and you know, sometimes you're in a mood, you want that, you know. Sometimes you will prefer that over the bigger than life production of All Things Must Pass. So it's compared to All Things Must Pass, maybe a bit underappreciated album. It's a very good album. Number 18, Please Please Me, debut album of the Beatles. It's the closest to what the Beatles probably sounded like live at the Cavern or live at the Star Club. Number 17, Tug of War, Paul McCartney, 1982, the first album he did after John Lennon was killed, and you can hear that. It's probably at that time it was his most grown up, most mature, most somber album, which also means the downside for me is you don't get the silly Paul McCartney, but you know, that was really the album he had to make after what had happened, you know, John Lennon getting killed, Wings disbanding, so being 40 years of age, so it was the right album at the right time, and it's a masterpiece. Number 16, now the opposite end, the not so mature, you know, it's just 3 years before that, it's the last Wings album, Back to the Egg, but that's Paul McCartney not being very grown up and silly, nonsensical lyrics, but I really loved that album. It's Paul McCartney's heavy rock album, you know, his reaction to punk rock and new wave, but it wouldn't be a Paul McCartney album if it wouldn't be eclectic, so it also has, with Arrow Through Me, one of his best funk songs, great ballads, even a music hall number with a Baby's Request, but the rock songs, the heavier rock songs, really, really great. It's the heaviest Beatles solo album in terms of rock sound, I would say. Number 15, Beatles for Sale, often underrated, or maybe nowadays no longer underrated because there's so many people proclaiming this is the most underrated Beatles album to a point where it's not underrated anymore. But I was always also one of those guys, you know, I always said this is the most underrated album, especially compared to with the Beatles and Our Hardest Night, which many people prefer over that. I think it's a transitional record. So it already hints into the more mature personal songwriting, especially the lyrics, of course, of the Help, Rubber Soul, Revolver Face, and especially the Lennon-McCartney. You know, the cover versions, some are a bit murky, but Lennon-McCartney stuff is brilliant on that album. You know, No Reply, 8 Days a Week, Every Little Thing, I Don't Want to Spoil the Party, I'll Follow the Sun. You know, it's not... Those songs aren't worse than the songs on Our Hardest Night, I would say. 14 is Plastic Ono Band, one of the most important Beatles solo albums, the angry John Lennon Primal Scream album. It's just number 14. I think, you know, the historical importance probably would deserve to be a top 10 maybe. Even it's not the type of album I like to listen to because, you know, music to me is also a bit of, it has to bring some joy and it has to be entertainment, and this is such a sparse, bare showing my anger album. It's a bit too much for me. Need some herbal tea after thinking about that angry album, you know. Number 13, again the opposite end, the yin and the yang, Lennon-McCartney, London Town, maybe the most whimsical, the most softy Paul McCartney Wings album ever. You know, it's the album before Back to the Egg. If Back to the Egg is the heavy rock album, this is the folk rock album. Although my favorite song on that album and one of my all-time favorite Wings songs, Morsmos and the Grey Goose, is one of the most one of the heaviest songs by Wings. Great. A song that's eerie and funny at the same time. Spectacular song. Number 12, Let It Be. And when I'm talking about Let It Be, I mean the officially released May 1970 Spectre version of it. That was always the definitive version for me. Unlike Paul McCartney and other people, I really liked the way that Phil Spector, with those big arrangements, strings and choirs, and you know, it's just 3 songs, it's not like the whole album is like that. I think it was right to do that with the last Beatle album that was released when they split up, so it's like the final curtain with all those choirs, the long and winding road, but the rest of the album is, you know, it's not like that, you know. Dig It, Maggie May, those aren't overproduced Phil Spector things, those are like the Glyn Jones mixes, you know, just put in sequence differently. I really love the official Let It Be album, and I prefer it over Let It Be Naked or the Glyn Jones Get Back versions that he attempted. Number 11, slightly missing out the top 10. I prefer it to my number 10, but you know, sometimes the historical importance of an album is more important than what a fool like myself thinks, you know. But I really love Venus and Mars. I think it's the best A-side of any Beatles solo album, but the best song on the album is on side B, you know. Listen to What the Man Said is on side B, but still it manages to have the best, the most perfect side A on a vinyl solo album by the Beatles. The fantastic Wings album, Wings at the, not at the speed of sound, which didn't make my top 40, but at the height of their potential, I would say. I prefer it over my number 10, which is Band on the Run, Paul's most successful, most highly regarded solo album, because it's not the fault of Band on the Run that I personally may prefer Venus and Mars. It's just that the songs are so overplayed. Nowadays I don't really listen to that album. If I want to listen to that phase in Paul's career, the big successful Stadium, you know, the most successful phase in his solo career, which isn't my favorite phase of his overall of his solo career, but if I want to listen to that 74 to 76 phase, then Venus and Mars is by far my favorite album. But Band on the Run is probably the most important album, the album that saved his career, and there's no debate that songs like Band on the Run, Chet, Mrs. Vanderbilt, 1985, those are all mega classics and brilliant masterpieces of pop songs. So this album had to be in the top 10. Number 9 is Help. That's, to me, you know, maybe the most underrated Beatles album still. You know, Beatles for Sale got bit re-evaluated, but yet at the same time the album they did after that still waits for being rediscovered. You know, rediscovered, it's the Beatles. Each of those albums has probably sold more than 10 million copies, the most important, biggest band of all time. Of course, Help isn't an indie underground album, but you know, just in relation, you know, I'm putting it in relation to albums like Rubber Soul, Revolver, Sgt. Pepper, and you know, most people would say Help can't hold a candle to those albums, but I think Help is the first of those big masterpiece albums by the Beatles, or it would have been had they excluded the 2 covers, you know. Why did they put them on? Why did they have this strict rule to have 14 tracks? You know, after that they disbanded that rule with Sgt. Pepper, but at that time they thought we have to have 14 songs on an album. But you know, imagine Help as a 12-track album without Act Naturally and This Miss Lizzie, then I would say it's almost as good as a collection of songs as Rubber Soul or Revolver. But it has those 2 songs, so that's the reason why it's just number 9. Number 8, Imagine, my favorite John Lennon solo album. That was his peak as a pop songwriter, I would say. 10 songs, each of those songs is almost perfect, I would say. Number 7, Abbey Road. In recent years, you know, with the younger generations, with the Spotify streamers, it's, you know, Spotify charts don't lie, it's the most streamed album with the, you know, Something, Come Together, I think are the most streamed, Here Comes the Sun are the most streamed Beatles songs ever. It's a bit a pity that George Harrison, you know, passed away before the rise of Spotify. It would have been cool for him to see that 2 of the 3 most streamed Beatles songs are by him, you know, the Dark Horse Beatle, the Quiet Beatle. I think he would have liked that. But and those are brilliant songs, and it's a brilliant album, and I think most people nowadays, younger people, would have it higher. It's probably the number 1 of that list for most of those people. But I'm an older Beatle fan. Of course I like it too, it's my number 7, but it doesn't really sound like the classic Beatles sound that I love. They, on this album, their last recorded album, that they had 16 tracks instead of 8 tracks, so they could put on more overdubs. It's the album with the synthesizer, with the Moog synthesizer, which was invented half a year before that. It has overall a kind of a cleaner sound. It's hinting more into the 70s and almost prog proggy in some areas. That I was never really into that sound aesthetic too much. But of course, brilliant album. What can I say? 6, Ram, my favorite Paul McCartney album. Paul and Linda McCartney. It was 1971. I don't want to repeat the story that we are repeating in each of those videos when we're talking about Ram. You know, critics hated it back then. Now it's redeemed itself as one of the best Beatles solo albums. But yeah, that's the story. And it redeemed itself, of course, deservedly so. It's a brilliant album. It's Paul. It's most eclectic. You know, it is adventurous and yet at the same time very the pop genius with the great pop melodies, pop harmonies, but also an honest, angry Paul when he's venting about the Beatles split and his frustrations, and you know, everything that you could like about a Paul McCartney album as a Paul McCartney fan in one album. Great. Number 5 is my favorite George Harrison album and my favorite Beatles solo album. So only 4 Beatles albums I prefer over this album. It's All Things Must Pass, of course. No big surprise. The big Phil Spector Larger Than Life triple album. What can you say about that album that hadn't been said before? It's a perfect album, and you know, maybe on another day it could have also been my number 4 album. You know, my top 3 albums, it would never be in my top 3 in this video, because my top 3 albums in this list are also my top 3 albums of all time by anyone. Since 20 years I haven't changed my top 3 albums in probably 20 or 25 years. So All Things Must Pass couldn't have been a top 3 album in that video, but maybe on another day, like tomorrow or in 1 month when I'm making this video, it could have been number 4, but number 4 is Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and it's a tie. I usually don't like those ties in such ranking videos because it's a bit lazy, but I had to make a tie here. It's Sgt. Pepper tied with Magical Mystery Tour, because I never quite know how to rank Magical Mystery Tour, because the originally intended thing was an EP. You know, in Britain when it came out it was just an EP with the 6 songs from the movie, and the album that got canonized later on was the American version, which was an album where the B-side were all the fantastic hit singles from 1967. So if you judge it on the songs, you know, the B-side includes All You Need Is Love, Strawberry Fields Forever, Penny Lane, Hello Goodbye. If you judge it just on the songs, it's probably better than Sgt. Pepper. But you know, I never can really rank it that way because it wasn't that artistic statement. Sgt. Pepper was conceived as an album with those tracks and with a concept even. And Magical Mystery Tour is just, you know, an EP plus a compilation. But this is, you know, from the listening experience, it's as good or sometimes even better than Sgt. Pepper. So my number 4 is just everything the Beatles released in 1967 in one place. Number 3, and now my top 3 albums of all time by anyone. Number 3 is Revolver. Make it quick because we all know everything about those albums. Revolver is my number 3. I slightly prefer Rubber Soul over it, because Rubber Soul, you know, overall as an album entity maybe Revolver is stronger, but Rubber Soul has probably the stronger individual tracks, and I'm such a big, you know, songwriting is the most important part of my music fandom, and just look at the Red and Blue albums. You know, no album has so many songs on the Red or the Blue album as Rubber Soul. I think 5 or 6 tracks, and 2 of those tracks, Nova Man and In My Life, are in my top 10 all-time favorite Beatles songs. I know because I ranked all Beatles songs in a video series a year ago. So I always preferred it slightly, but those are 2 perfect albums. Number 1 album, my all-time favorite album, isn't really a perfect album, but that's what makes it so great. It's the White Album, of course. You know, it includes songs like Wild Honey Pie and stuff like that, but it wouldn't be as cool without that, you know. Those people always say it should have been a single album, a brilliant 14-track album. It wouldn't be as good, you know. It would be better songs, or no bad songs on there, but it really needs that time to unfold and to breathe, and it's really an experience. That album is an experience. Or like John Lennon. Or like Noel Gallagher put it, it's the Bible. He said that's the Bible. It's the alpha and the omega of pop music, you know. All styles you can think of on one album, and even styles that weren't really invented yet at that time are also proto versions of those genres are on that album. So the White Album is my favorite album. And thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, and until next time.